Hi there, welcome back to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your time and attention. Do you want to learn a little bit about a powerful technique that can really help you in life? It's called reframing. If you want to learn something that can really help turn your thinking around and your attitude around, stick with it. Stick with me for the next little while. I'll talk about this reframing. I'm going to give some examples and hopefully I'll be able to help you apply it in your own life. So this idea of reframing is about basically changing your perspective about how the way you look at something can really transform then the way you feel about it. So our minds really do shape our reality and our thoughts have so much power. So if we're able to work with those thoughts and be able to reframe something and think about it from a different perspective, find a different angle, then it can have a really big effect on your life and your feeling about that situation or that circumstance, that person, whatever it is. So to give you some really concrete examples that I've applied in my life, which I think is useful, I I can think of a time. I've got 4 children, so I've been through times where I've had several of my children have not traveled well in the car, and I've had to drive on my own with them, and they've been screaming in the back in their chair and crying a lot. And it's very, very confronting. If you're a parent or a mother, you know that when your child's crying, you want to comfort them, you want to make them feel better, and it can get that cry can get cause a lot of anxiety and stress. So confronted with this and having to drive a vehicle and be safe in the vehicle and not have an accident, it would really be difficult, so challenging. I would want to help my child. However, I needed to get from A to B in a particular time, and I could pull over, but every time I pulled over and put them back in the chair, they would start the crying or the screaming again. So, and I've known other parents that have had this situation. So I used to be just tormented and so caught up with the crying, and I just couldn't concentrate on the driving, and it was, getting to a point where it was dangerous. So I used this reframing technique, which was, instead of focusing on the fact that my child was crying and screaming and I couldn't stop them because I was driving and I didn't really have a choice, I had to get somewhere, I reminded myself that my child was healthy, strong, alive, and crying with full vigor because they had the strength. And that if it was another way around, if they were sick or, they weren't alive and they were unable to cry, how much more distressing that would be for me, how much worse that would be. So, in reframing the whole way I thought about the crying, that wasn't to mean that I wanted to leave them crying as soon as I could stop and get them out. And as soon as I got to my destination, or if I had extra time to stop and calm them, I could do that. However, if they just wouldn't stop crying and I had to get somewhere and I had to deal with this screaming while I was driving, this is the thought pattern that I followed. I even would connect with people like in Palestine or war zones who had lost their children to bombs. And I would think about how much they would want their children to be crying, to be screaming with full life and vigor and strength. So that type of reframing really helped me. Another type of reframing, and I heard it mentioned in a podcast the other day, and I will put the link for this podcast below because I'm interested in sharing more and more resources. Her name is Maggie Dent. She runs a podcast called Parental as Anything, and they talk about parenting things. So it is more applicable to parents. This podcast was talking about having difficult teenagers. So teenagers that come home, slam doors, scream, get angry and express all their emotions. And this parent had written into her to ask for advice around their teenagers' behavior. And Maggie Dent, the way she talked about it was, how about instead of thinking that this is a problem that your teenager is expressing all these big emotions at home, how about looking at it from the perspective that your teenager feels safe enough to come home and express those emotions, and that those emotions are being expressed safely in the household, because they feel safe to do so. So rather than thinking that that's an issue, think that that's actually a really positive thing, that they're able to find this safe space to express their full range of emotions. That's another example of reframing. Another thing of reframing is, I lost some employment, a year or so back, and well paid, good job, and it was hard. I had to go from, having some good salary to basically, not having much money at all. And I could have got down and upset about this and thought about how bad it was that I didn't have this job anymore. However, not having this job freed up some time for me to do some other things and also be more resourceful and live simpler and connect to what really I wanted to do. So that was another example of me working with the situation that I was presented with and reframing. Now, there are situations that are really hard. You can't always reframe. You need to allow yourself to feel grief or feel sad about a situation, or there are highly stressful situations, involving poverty or loss of loved ones. And I'm not saying to constantly just think that you can just think everything's so positive and everything's okay. I guess when it's just something very, very challenging, it's rather than thinking, why is this happening to me? The reframing that situation could be, what can I learn from this? And just by being able to switch that mentality between, why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this? To what can I learn from this? Is a process of reframing. So even the fact that you might have had a really difficult upbringing, or you have a difficult situation in your life right now, what can you learn from that? How can you reframe that to make that into something that I mention it in my descriptions? Like, how can you turn struggles into triumph and pain into power? What reframing technique can you use to transform something that's you're facing that you can't avoid, because that's life. Life is going to bring suffering. How can you transform that by reframing, looking at it from a different angle, taking another perspective and asking yourself, what can I learn from this? Or what is another way of seeing this? And using this technique is transformative. It can help you in so many ways. So like, subscribe, follow, share my content, and I will keep sharing some of these techniques that I've learned that help me with examples, and I hope you're enjoying it. Take care.